We are going to continue with Unit 1, Topic 1.3, Democracy versus Authoritarianism. Again, these videos are for educational purposes only and align with the AP Comparative Government and Politics curriculum. After this topic, you will be able to contrast how democratic and authoritarian regimes exercise power, contrast democratic and authoritarian regimes regarding the following characteristics: rule of law, elections, media, government transparency. Okay, so this is a political cartoon of Putin. All right, so Putin always is going to be depicted in political cartoons with like sunken cheeks and his receding hairline. So just to kind of, if you see one of him and it doesn't label him, that is how Putin will be depicted. Okay, so he's saying Russian democracy in action. I've decided to retain my power. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nothing. So it's a critique of how he doesn't really allow people to petition or oppose him. All right, state of democracy. Okay, so this map is going to take into account electoral processes, pluralism, which remember that it means that groups are allowed to influence the outcome of political policy, civil liberties such as speech, press, right to petition and protest, the function of government, political participation, political culture. So democratic is going to be a regime where government authority is invested in the people. Government power is based on the consent of the governed. Most democracies are going to have a Republican style of democracy where you have people that are going to be representing the masses, okay, where the will of the people is carried out by the representatives that the people elect. Authoritarian is a system of government where authority is invested in a small group of people who exercise power over the state without being constitutionally responsible to the people and don't really have to follow rule of law. I mentioned illiberal democracies and hybrid regimes in 1.1 and 1.2. So remember I said illiberal democracies don't mean that they're like not, big D Democratic, Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Bernie Sanders. No. It means that they're democracies that are not completely healthy. All right. So they could also be called hybrid regimes where they have a little bit of authoritarianism and a little bit of democracy mixed in. So you could have maybe elections, but there's only one political party. You might have a theocracy where the people that are really calling the shots are going to be like ayatollahs, like we see in Iran, which are Muslim religious leaders, but you still have elected officials. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And we're going to break each one of them down for the countries. So again, you could see we've seen a couple of maps with this information on it. Just wanted to point this out. So we have full democracies, flawed democracies, hybrid regimes, authoritarians. There's Mexico. There's the UK. There's Nigeria right there. This map has it in purple, which I agree with more than the other map that we looked at. There is Iran, China, and Russia. Okay, factors that indicate the degree of democracy or authoritarianism. First is it rolling with rule of law or rule by law? If it's rolling with rule of law, everybody is treated equally under the law. There's transparency. There's an independent judiciary, harking back to Federalist Paper 78. Independent judiciary is necessary to protect the civil rights and liberties of the folks. And there is an accessible legal remedy. So, like, you can fight for your rights in court. Okay. It's not, decisions aren't made arbitrarily just to help out individual government officials. But in authoritarian regimes, you're going to see more of rule by law, where the government officials in power make random policy decisions to maintain that power. We're definitely going to see a lot of that in China and in Russia. The degree of state influence or control of the media. So democracy, of course, there's going to be free press, freedom of media, very limited government regulation. In an authoritarian regime, it's going to be censored, preventing information from leaking or coming out. So remember, prior restraint, we learned that term when we were studying New York Times versus US, where the government doesn't allow information to be made public, punishing watchdogs, and being very critical of the press. The degree and practice of free and fair elections. So in a democracy, there's going to be competition, which means there's going to be multiple parties and candidates. You're going to allow for election observers, poll watchers. You're going to have fair media coverage where both candidates are covered. So in the United States, we have equal access time. And there's going to be an expansion of suffrage or voting rights. In authoritarian, you're going to see a dominance of one party. Competition is super suppressed, if even existent. Suffrage is limited. You hold elections so the people feel like they have choice and voice, but in reality, people really don't have any choice. But it's kind of to set up that mirage of democracy. Hey, we're going to have Russian elections. Oh, okay. Right. The degree of transparency and government decision making, again, that's going to go back to democracies allowing the media to work as a watchdog. You're going to see freedom of information laws that require the government to make policy decisions and votes public. We have them in the United States. You have authoritarian decisions are just made in the dark and people have to follow them. And then the nature of citizen participation in government. In a democracy, you're going to have a healthy civic society or civil society, which is going to include participation in interest groups, the ability to have social movements and protest, and civil rights are protected. In authoritarian, you're going to have an oppression of civil rights and liberties. Interest group membership is driven by the government. So like the government might make an interest group for people to join. So people, again, feel like they have some control and voice and choice in the government, but they don't. It's just a mirage. So how much confidence do you have that the 2020 presidential election will be held fairly? I'm going to use this example from the United States because it kind of correlates to whether or not we are a healthy democracy. If you were a Democrat, you were going to be more likely to believe that the election was going to be held fairly. And if you were a Republican, you were more than likely believe that elections were not going to really be held fairly, and independents were the most skeptical. Okay, that kind of plays into a couple of different aspects of the degree of democracy in the United States, the lack of belief in free and fair elections, and which might lead to the lack of participation in the voting process, which is dangerous in preserving the healthy democracy that the United States has. So that's why talking about, conspiracies around stolen elections is not great because it can undermine our democracy. Checks and balances and separation of powers. So the branches of government in a democratic regime are going to be independent of one another, where in an authoritarian regime, it's going to be pretty clear that one branch of government has more power than any other. So like the executive branch, in Russia, Putin has more power than the legislative, and he has a lot of power and control over the judicial branch. All right, so we're going to compare the UK to authoritarian China. So the UK is going to have rule of law. They have free media, the Guardian, the BBC. Those are two sources of media. We'll get into media more when we get to that part of the curriculum. We have a competitive two-party, I call it a two-party plus. Most political scientists would call it a two-party plus because they have two prominent parties, which is going to be the Conservative Party, which you see in blue, the Labour Party, which is depicted in red on this map of the UK. So this shows you how the different parts of the United Kingdom voted in those parliamentary elections. Then you have a couple of different regional parties. The orange is the Lib Dems, and we'll talk more about them. And then the yellow is the Scottish National Party. So there's a lot of competition compared to other countries that we're going to study. There's high transparency, a lot of critiques and criticism of Boris Johnson, a lot of critiques and criticism of Brexit and stuff like that, and high citizen participation. In China, you got ruled by law, heavily censored media, the Great Firewall of China. I know this is really teeny and it's hard to see, but it basically is going to explain how China is able to censor what you are able to access on social media. Not free, not fair elections. There's one party, and you can only vote at your local level. So you vote at your village level or your city level, and then that's the only decision you get to make. And then those people will make decisions for you, and so on and so forth. And we'll go into that in more depth when we cover elections. Low transparency and limited and restricted civil participation. Okay.